also after was the coat, the hat, and the other garments that those three wise men were wearing, because what I've done is match those up with the garment worn by the Anunnaki goddess Mari. When she descended into the underworld, she wore her miracle garment. She wore her Shagura helmet, which Zecharia Sitchin said literally translated, Shagura means that which makes go far into the universe. And she wore her other garments called the armor of God. And I'm convinced that those accoutrements, the coat, the hat, and the other garments that the three wise men were wearing was in fact the armor of God, and it's some kind of a Stargate get-up. And what it really is, these are all symbols of the transformed or perfected human, the light being human, that can then access that gate and translate or travel to other star systems or perhaps to other dimensions and back to Earth again, and then remanifest themselves in a physical form.
That's why I was referring to the episode of Stargate Universe. They go through the sun, nothing happens, but they come out somewhere else. You're saying that they're going through a fiery place and they don't get burned. Mm-hmm. Is the sun a Stargate, William?
Yes, it is. According to ancient Egyptian myth and religion, the sun is the way and the truth and the light. The way to get to heaven is through the sun. So, for example, in the Egyptian Book of the Dead, you'll see vignettes with the lions of yesterday and tomorrow symbolizing eternity on either side of the sun disk. And above it is the Egyptian symbol for heaven. The way you read that cartoon ultimately is it's saying the sun is a portal. The sun is a gateway to heaven. It is the gate of eternity. And in fact, one of the things that I'm researching right now is a consequence of studying the Stargate suit, which is really the light body, is this. There was a story about Enoch, who was a pre-flood figure, probably an Atlantean sage or scholar, who was taken up to heaven by the archangel Michael. And Michael rubs this oil all over Enoch's body, and suddenly Enoch is transformed from a human into one of the glorious ones. He's glowing rays. He's illuminated. He's literally a light being. And it appears that one of the requirements for opening these portals is this transformation of the body, and there's this oil, this substance that might even have been the anointing oil of Jesus, in fact, that transforms the body into the light body, or what the Tibetans call the rainbow body. It's the oil of the perfected ones, as it's called. They're perfect because they're completely pure. They're beings of pure light. Well, recently, some Russian scientists have hypothesized that in their studies that wormholes might exist between distant stars. And they went one step forward to say that they believe that at the heart of some stars, these wormhole stars, there might be some kind of a plant within that star that manufactures a fluid, which they called the perfect fluid. And when I read that, I'm thinking, well, yeah, absolutely. This is the oil of the perfected ones. They know how to harvest this substance from the sun that transforms them into beings of light, because, in fact, this oil that was rubbed on Enoch, it's described as glittering like the rays of the sun. Well, it glitters like the rays of the sun because it's probably the sun that produces it. And so I'm citing this as another example of the way in which modern science seems to be catching up at long last with what the ancients already knew. The sun's a stargate, the sun's a wormhole. It produces the perfect fluid that opens the mouth of the wormhole long enough for perhaps a soul or a light being to travel through.
Can this oil cause ascension, and is there any relationship between the oil and white powder gold?
Well, the white powder gold is a tricky one. That originally, if you're thinking of the white powder gold as the manna from heaven, it was described as being dew-like and manifested with the rising sun. But this oil is different. I think the dew and this oil the manna and this oil are two different things. They might originally come from the same source, but I'm tracking them as two separate things.
So Saddam Hussein wanted to make Iraq, especially Baghdad, a great tourist destination where people could explore our origins unlike any other place on earth. But you know, William, I was never a fan of Saddam or any other dictator. But Is Iraq better off today than it was before March of 2003?
Is Iraq better off today than pre-Saddam days? I haven't been there personally. I would very much like to go, but from what I had seen, I would have to say no. And this is in part based on my travels in Egypt. What most Americans, Westerners, typically aren't aware of is just how macho the Arab world really is. It's a totally alpha society. Although the families are run by the mothers, they still need that really strong father figure, the Mubarak types, the Saddam types. And that seems to be what works in the Arab world. And so when we come in there trying to impose democracy, while a segment of the population wants it, it seems that the psyche hasn't been prepared for it. And to try to just superimpose it or overlay it on a civilization that has been operating the same way for the past couple of thousand years seems like a really tall order. So I'm not convinced that Iraq is better off today than it was under Saddam. I think that we probably did a good thing getting rid of Saddam ultimately. But whether or not it's going to be totally beneficial for the Iraqi people remains to be seen.
And one quick detour. I heard that during the uprisings in Egypt, you were there and you were cut right in the middle. Is that correct?
I was right in the middle of it. I had a group of 24 people with me, and we suddenly found ourselves in what felt like a movie. I mean, I would joke with them during it that, hey, people like to come to Egypt for initiations. They want to go into the temples and they want to have an experience. They want to remember perhaps something about themselves. They want to connect with a higher energy. And in the ancient world, one of the ways that you did this was what key part of it was about overcoming fear. You had to increase your personal belief system and leave fear out. So one of the stories they tell is that they would put the initiates in a pool full of crocodiles and you had to swim across. Well, today we don't have a pool full of crocodiles to help you overcome your fear. We just drop you into a country that suddenly descends into chaos, and now you have to find a way to get home. And that's what we did. It was an extraordinary experience. We all kind of pulled together and had to keep ourselves psyched up at all times, focused on the victory that was at hand. We saw ourselves ultimately getting home safely and having a high story to tell, and I think that helped us tremendously.
I remember hearing your story right after you returned from Egypt, and it was pretty emotional. But for the listeners, tell us what the cylinder seals are.
Cylinder seals are very fascinating pieces of ancient communications technology. They're crystal, made of crystal, and they're about the size of a tube of lipstick. And what happens is scenes will be etched upon these crystals, and when they're rolled out, like for example on clay, it reveals a cartoon. They're sort of like silly putty in a way, and that whatever is in them can be rolled out and you can see the scene. So it's an ingenious way of preserving information for a very long time. And very often these seals have mundane references within them, but other times they show the most extraordinary scenes. For example, some of my favorites portray the sun god Shamash as he rises through the heavens through celestial gates or doors. And they literally show him going through this gateway or this doorway with his attendants on either side. And it's very clear that these are ascension scenes that we're seeing on these cylinder seals, and these are just some that are in the in museums. Like the Chicago Oriental Museum is a good example that has quite a few of these really interesting gateway or portal cylinder seals. They show in another scene Shamash riding through the stars on his celestial boat. They're often very stellar, and this is the type of thing that gets me excited, because if I'm seeing something like this in the cases at the J.P. Morgan Library or at the Chicago Oriental Museum, what's back in the basement? What is yet to be revealed to the public? I mean, it's just astonishing. And again, I'm convinced that Saddam had his own personal collection of these things, and if he had the bug up for him like I do, he was doing his darndest to dig deeper and find the the really esoteric ones.
Didn't other countries, all the way from the 1800s, take a lot of the artifacts from Iraq, their national patrimony, and eventually Saddam Hussein started calling all those countries to say, hey, that's ours, and we want it back. Is that correct?
Yeah, this was part of the Ashurbanipal project. A lot of those pre-flood texts, or alleged pre-flood texts, or the early Sumerian stuff, like the Epic of Gilgamesh, which is the oldest human story, an immortality tale telling about the ancient Sumerian king's quest for immortality and his search for the gate of the gods. This stuff was they call them the Puritans of Babylon. They came into Iraq, they carted all this stuff up, took it back to England, put some of it on display in the British Museum. The rest of it is still in crates, very much like you mentioned the white powder gold. My friend Lawrence Gardner used to tell me about all of the stuff about the manna and the white powder that's still in the crates in the basement of the British Museum, hasn't even been unpacked. And this is a really important part of the history of what has happened here in the 20th century as well as here in the 21st century, because when they first started going into Babylon back in the 1840s and 50s, you had two groups of people that were going. You had your hardcore Bible thumpers that were there, and they were digging up the sands of Iran and Iraq and elsewhere trying to prove that the Bible was true. They felt like they found evidence of the temples that Ezekiel was at, and so forth. And then you had another group of people, mostly coming out of Germany, who were going to the same sites, the same temples, the same locations, looking for evidence that the story of Atlantis was true. And so you had these two competing factions, the one coming out of America trying to prove the Bible, then the ones coming out of Germany trying to prove that all this goes back to Atlantis and this great former Aryan race, as they like to call it, that connected themselves with the mighty ones of old, the sons of God who came from the stars. And so both of them had the same agenda, but wanted to utilize the information for different purposes, and both ultimately sought to conceal this information from the majority of the public.
Going back to the cylinder seals for a moment, they're made of crystals. I think of a USB drive. If we see a USB drive, it's a small item, but it can carry a lot of information. I've been told that crystals can hold an enormous amount of information. The question is, how do we access that information from the crystal?
Well, the information is actually etched on the outside, the exterior of the crystal. And so you would roll it out on wet clay, and when it dries, it reveals the scene that's etched on the crystal. Now, that does bring up an interesting question about what might possibly be held energetically within that crystal. And having never had access to them from the point of being able to hold them in my hand, I don't have any personal experience with that, nor do I know of any scholars that have written about such a thing. But that's a very good question, and would be certainly a really cool experience to actually be able to hold some of these 5,000-year-old crystals.
And regarding the artifacts that they have in crates, not even displayed, what is the purpose and why are they keeping these artifacts sequestered this way?
Well, for the most part, the reason that they would sequester the information or hide it is because it contradicts the official story, the traditional Judeo-Western Christian story that we all began in the Garden of Eden, and then we're moving forward to Judgment Day, and all will be well. I mean, that's the problem with it. If you've got knowledge that contradicts that story or certainly predates it, now you've got a real problem, because now you're opening up the can of worms there, or can of wormholes rather, because it's all about, well, who were these God beings, these beings that came from the stars, and how come they never show them flying around in flying saucers, for one thing? Well, it's because they're traveling through gateways. But how come all these seals just show these God beings coming and going through these gateways? Where are these gates, and how can we access them? Those are kind of dangerous questions from the Judeo-Christian perspective, although we have to acknowledge that our fundamental archetype, the story of Adam and Eve, is a story about us being deprived of that gate. We all know that Adam and Eve had a little problem with God. They got some wisdom from a figure referred to as the serpent. Next thing you know, they're evicted from the Garden of Eden. Yahweh, that Old